Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and I want to just do a really quick video for this week, just addressing some very minor points that's nevertheless out there. And I'd like to just show you what I found running down the details, because here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse, we go to the sources and we try to run through and double check everything. And this has to do with a quotation from Bruce M. Metzger, a very prominent Protestant textual scholar who noted in his introduction to the Apocrypha that there were two old Latin Bibles that were translated before the Council of Trent that reflected the Protestant canon, or at least that's how Metzger is quoted by Protestants who use this quote for establishing the Protestant canon. So, in the big picture of things, it's really not important, but nevertheless, let's take a look to see what Metzger has to say. Let's actually look at those Bibles, and they're quite hard to find, by the way, and see what they have to say about the issue. So that's what we're going to do today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right, so here we are. I'm doing a breakdown of this work. It's actually quite old, and it's very typical, a really good example of a full-blown standard defense of the Protestant Old Testament canon. And I ran across this quote from Bruce Metzger that I've seen elsewhere. And since it's somewhat popular out there, I thought, why not actually look at this evidence, see exactly what's going on? Because the way Metzger is quoted, it sounds as if he's saying that, this is all part of the larger apology that before the Council of Trent, the majority of scholars and Catholics actually held on to the Protestant canon, and then Trent changed everything. And so it tries to build a case for this kind of like scholarly majority here. And so let's take a look. Here's the quote from Metzger in this article. And it says, well, we can kind of skip over some of the other stuff. Subsequent to Jerome's time and down to the period of the Reformation, a continuous succession of the most learned fathers and theologians in the West maintained the distinctive and unique authority of the books of the Hebrew canon. Yeah, well, we've done some work already on that. A scholarly continuous succession of the more learned fathers knows that there are learned fathers, then there's the more learned fathers that get it right on this issue. Actually, it's a pretty thin list, and they're all they're all different. They're all different how they approach this. So this is kind of a poor generalization. We'll continue though. Such a judgment, for example, was reiterated on the very eve of the Reformation by Cardinal Ximenes in the preface of the magnificent Complutensian polyglot. I always get mixed up on that word. Complutensian polyglot. Say that three times really quick. Edition of the Bible, which he edited 1514 through 1517. And so we've covered Ximenes and the polyglots. No biggie there. Moreover, the earliest Latin version of the Bible in modern times, that's a curious one. I kind of ponder that one. When exactly does modern times begin, and how would you determine what the earliest version would be in the modern times? I don't know, but anyway, that's nitpicking. Let's continue. From the original languages by the scholarly Dominican Sanctus Pagini and published in Lyon in 1528, with commendatory letters from Pope Adrian VI and Pope Clement VII, sharply separates the text of the canonical books from the text of the apocryphal books. Now, Metzger's description here makes it sound like Paganini's Bible, this translation, separates these books along canonical lines so that you have the proto-canon as affirmed as canonical in this Bible, and then you have the so-called Apocrypha that's not. So I wanted to check this out, so that's what we're going to do today. So here's some notes. I will bring it up on my computer. I'm going to have to adjust everything. My apologies. Unfortunately, I can't get Zoom to work on my normal desktop, so I'm using a laptop, which makes it very cumbersome. So please bear with me on this. Okay, so here I have a clip of this. Here's my notes and translations. By the way, please forgive errors in my translation of Latin. The typeface is a little blotchy, and sometimes it's hard to make out letters. And, there's other obstacles as well. So this is my best translation, and I try to keep it as literal as possible. So I'm not accused of some sort of biased translation in this regard. But is it true? Does this Bible separate the canonical books from the Apocrypha, like Metzger intimates? Well, here we have, well, first, I guess I should give the background of this Bible, because that's very important. As you might know, right around when Luther comes to the fore, there was a rebirth in the interest of rediscovering ancient languages, especially the study of the Hebrew language and in the Latin West. So this became kind of a mania. And so there's a lot of work being done by it. And that's what the claim to fame of this particular Bible is. The Pagnini Bible 1528 was a Bible that was translated directly from a Hebrew text into Latin. So this is cutting edge technology for the time. And so, of course, it made a big splash. Now, you might say, well, what's the big deal about that? Because we have the Latin Vulgate, and that's what Jerome did. Jerome translated most of the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this is not a Vulgate translation. This is a fresh translation. Actually, from what I understand, a pretty literal translation from the Hebrew and to Latin. Okay, that's why it's cutting edge. Now, in regards to the other books that aren't in Hebrew, like the Deuterocanonical books or the New Testament, Paganini revises them. Okay, so he revises them from the Greek. And that's what this Bible is all about. Okay, that's important because that's why the Old Testament books are segregated. It isn't because of a different canonical weight or measure. It's not like anticipation of Protestant Bibles. The separation is due to the fact that the publisher wants the reader to know which books are directly translated from the Hebrew as opposed to those that are just revised. Okay. Because after all, that's the selling point of the Bible. So here we are. This is at the very end of Malachi. And as you can see here, it says, Liber Malachi explicit. Okay. And then after Malachi, it gives this in Latin. And I'll just give you my English translation, the best I could make out, because like I said, the letters aren't really clear. Pretty sure this is what it says. It says the end of the old instrument newly created by the most reverend professor of sacred theology, Paganini. Okay. So that's the end of the Old Testament. And then notice it says the end of that was created by Paganini. Okay. Now, then you have a separation. There's a blank page. And then it begins the other section of the Old Testament with Tobit or Tobias. Okay. And here we see in all caps an inscription that says, beginning of the books of the Hagiographa, which are not in Hebrew, among the canonical books. Now, I know I could probably put that in better English, but I wanted to try to keep it as close to the Latin as possible. And then it says the beginning, the prologue of Blessed or Saint Jerome, presbyter in the book of Tobias. So basically it begins and it repeats Jerome's preface to Tobit. Okay. But I think that inscription is the most important thing. What's the publisher telling the reader in terms of why these books are separated from the rest? It's because these are canonical books, but they're not from Hebrew, where before they're canonical books from Hebrew. Okay. So what does this tell us about Metzger's distinction? Well, it's not distinguishing the non-canonical from the canonical books like Metzger says. All it does is it wants to alert the reader which books were freshly translated from the Hebrew as opposed to other books. Okay. But it understands the other books to be canonical. So it's really an artifact of this endeavor of Paganini. It's kind of an accident that there's a separation here in a way. It has nothing to do in terms of canonicity. So this isn't like Luther before Luther, right? In fact, even at this time in 1517, like we saw on my previous long format video, Calvin v. Luther, Martin Luther, 1517, was still using the deuterocanonical books as proof in debate, even sometimes very explicitly calling it canonical books. So Luther doesn't do his flip-flop until 1519, and he really doesn't become consistent in his rejection of the books until the 1520s or so. All right. So anyway, just for the sake of completion, let's look at the other deuterocanonical books here. Here is the preface to the book of Judith. And it says the book of Judith begins revised by the same Santis Paganini, and so on and so forth. And then we have the book of wisdom. It says, the beginning of the prologue, the book of wisdom, has this short paragraph. It says the book of wisdom is not among the Hebrews, hence the style itself has a more Greek eloquence. The Jews affirm that this is Philo, and this was a common theory in the early church that perhaps Philo of Alexandria was the author of wisdom. He who is therefore enamored of wisdom, then it says, because in him the coming of Christ, who is the wisdom of the Father, and his passion are evidently expressed. And this is something that the same kind of comments you see in the Glossia Ordinaria and elsewhere, where it says the book of wisdom predicts the things about the coming of Christ and his passion explicitly. Okay. Not something you would expect to find in mere human apocrypha, by the way. Then it says the end of the prologue. Then it says the book of wisdom revised by the same Paganini. All right. Moving on. We have Ecclesiasticus, otherwise known as the book of Sirach. And here's the end of Rabbini's prologue. And then it says the beginning of the book of Ecclesiasticus revised by the same Santis Paganini. And so it's just over and over just saying where he revises the books as opposed to where he translates the books. And then here we have Baruch, preface to the book of Baruch. The prophet begins. This is really interesting because these Bibles are calling Baruch the prophet Baruch. Same thing, by the way, Calvin calls Baruch the prophet Baruch. It says the same. This was hard to make out. It's the script is not very clear, but I believe it says The same book which bears the name of Baruch is not found in the Hebrew canon, but in the Vulgate or the vernacular edition. And then it continues. In fact, I couldn't even make out some of the lettering and stuff, so I skip it. Then it says, they are written here for the sake of notice or reading, because they tell us many things about Christ and the very things we know. And then it says the book of the prophet Baruch begins revised by Paganini. All right, so that's interesting. Tells us many things about Jesus. Metzger didn't point that out, oddly enough. Then we have Maccabees, and this is something also we find in the Glossia Ordinaria, I believe, is when it comes to Maccabees, there's actually two prologues that are given. And in the second prologue, it repeats something that is mentioned before. I just want to highlight in the second prologue, it says the Maccabean books may not have been in the canon of the Hebrews. The church annotates it in the divine volumes. So it says it's not part of the Hebrew canon, but the church includes it amongst the divine volumes, which to me seems to indicate that the church understood it to be divine, that is, inspired. The beginning of First Maccabees, revised by the holy doctor Paganini, and then for Second Maccabees, says the beginning of Second Maccabees, revised by Paganini. So you can just see here, that's what's going on here. Unlike what Metzger says, that these books are separated between the canonical books and the Apocrypha. That's him describing this Bible through his Protestant lens, but that's not what the Bible's all about. And I think it's a little misleading, actually, because it insinuates that this Paganini was actually anticipating the Protestant distinction, when actually the only thing going on here is that he's translating from Hebrew, and the publishers just want the readers to know which books are translated straight from Hebrew as opposed to other books as well. Okay, let's go back to that quote from Metzger, and let's see. Okay, there's Paganini. And then he says, still another Latin Bible is one, an addition to, it's an edition of Jerome's Vulgate published in Nuremberg, there's a typo, by Johannes Petreius in 1527, presents the order of the books of the Vulgate, but specifies at the beginning of each apocryphal book that it is not canonical. Okay. So, here's another got you moment. So let's go and take a look at Petreius Vulgate. And by the way, this was extremely hard to find. Paganini book, you do a little search, you might be able to find it. This one was very difficult for me, but I did find it. And thanks be to God. Let's see if I can change this. Sorry. Again, boy, it's tough doing this on a laptop. I don't know how people do it. Okay. Sorry, let's move. Okay, here's the Petreius Bible. Again, excuse all my notes and everything here. I go through to I try to translate some of the introductory notes. We'll just skip that. Nothing super important there. If I find something important, I'll definitely do a video. But anyway, here's what I want to show you. The order of the books of, okay. Oddly enough, this Bible begins with two tables of contents. Okay. The first table of contents, here's the header, which says the order of the books of sacred scripture, which have been preserved until now in the old translation received by the church. Okay. Namely the Vulgate. So this is the list of the books accepted by the church. Now, what's interesting is, remember, Metzger insinuates that it's breaking with the church in that it begins each book by saying it's not canonical. Now, notice it says beginning of each apocryphal book says it's not canonical. So here's the first table of contents right here. I won't be able to fit it all on the screen. But anyway, what you notice that there's no appendix here, right? The deuterocanonical books are intermixed. There you go. They're intermixed amongst the Old Testament books. Okay. Why? Because this is the church's order as found in the Vulgate. Okay. However, it does distinguish these books by putting asterisks. But I was unable to find anywhere where it explains what the asterisks are supposed to indicate. Okay. So it's probably most likely that this is an indication that they're not part of the Hebrew canon, or maybe they're not found in Hebrew. I don't know. And I also want to point out too that this is not a canonical list. It's just the books as found in the old translation. It does include some non-canonical books, for example, like Fourth Ezra, because the Vulgates in most Bibles tended to be additive. The ancients like to preserve writings rather than allow them to go away, especially if they have some sort of affinity with biblical writings, because they figure this is good, interesting material to help illumine the scriptures. So different Bibles had different extra books in them, but they weren't considered canonical books, but they were there because they were helpful. Okay, so just FYI. But that's the first table of contents. The second table of contents, here's the header: the order of the books of the ancient instrument, which the Hebrews still keep. At least that's how I translate it. And here's that. Actually, I can fit it in the screen. And as you can see, it has the law, the prophets, first, earlier prophets, the latter prophets, the hagiographa, and then the New Testament, which it says, if I can read it, I believe it says that the New Testament, the Hebrews do not acknowledge. And then you have the Libri Apocrypha. Now remember, this table of contents is saying which books are found with the Hebrews, with the rabbis, okay? And so this is considered Apocrypha by the rabbis. Let's see. And that little subscript under Libri Apocrypha says the Apocrypha or non-canonical books which are among the Hebrews. Okay. And underneath it, not only do you have the Deuterocanonical books and the Deutero sections in Daniel and Esther, but you also have some odd ones that's kind of interesting. For example, you have the Prayer of Manasseh, which Martin Luther loved, and in fact, he concluded it in his German translation. And also, let's see, I believe it's also Esdras third and fourth is also there as well. So again, pretty wide. And it has two books of the Maccabees. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, right? This book kind of is trying to give what traditionally is found in the Catholic Bible and also indicate which ones are found amongst the rabbis. Okay, so it kind of has a split personality in a way. To say it leans heavily on Jerome is an understatement. In fact, I was amazed at how many works of Jerome are reproduced in this Bible. I wish I had a bound copy. I'd love to see how big it would be. But they have Jerome's letter to Paulinus, its preface to Pentateuch, preface to or prologue to Joshua, the preface to the Book of Kings, which is Kings and Samuel. This is known as the helmeted preface. This is where Jerome really hammers down that the Deuterocanon's Apocrypha. In fact, there's a notation here in Latin in this Bible, which says, that's where he distinguishes the canonical and Apocrypha books. You have his preface to Paraliponum, preface to Esdras, preface to Tobit, Judith, Job, Esther, Psalms. As you can see, pretty much every preface that he ever wrote is in this, according to the prologue to Wisdom. I have a feeling that's that little quote, probably from his prologue to the books of Solomon. But yeah, look at that. And also other letters as well. Daniel, these are all in this Bible. So again, I mentioned this before in other videos, but when you get to the Middle Ages, Jerome's prestige is through the roof. I mean, almost to the point of gross exaggeration, because he is the translator of the translation used in the West, known popularly as the Vulgate. There is a pun. Um, and he also was one of the very few early church fathers that knew Hebrew and wrote about Hebrew. And so, with the rebirth of interest in Hebrew language, his writings were very much cherished. And so, when it comes to the biblical, anyone studying the Bible, you're going to read a lot of his critical prefaces. And that's where he has all his guns aimed at the Deuterocanon. Now, what about Metzger's comment that it says that, but it specifies at the beginning of each apocryphal book that it is not canonical? Well, you can already see with the split personality of this book that it's going to have to explain to the readers which ones are held by the Hebrews and which ones aren't. And that's where things get messy, especially since it's so indebted to Jerome. It's going to mix Jerome's language in there. So Metzger, I think, is a little closer to being correct at this Bible, but I think he still misses the point too, and maybe over exaggerates a little bit, because this Bible understands these books to be authentic members of sacred scripture. In fact, here, this is a really cool feature of this book also, or this Bible, is it gives a summary of all the books of the Bible, and it gives like a one-line summary for each chapter of each book, which is pretty amazing. So here you have the title page here of the chief books of the Bible. And you can see here it has Tobias, it has Third Esdras, it has Judith, it has a summary of Wisdom, it has a summary of Sirach, and a summary of Baruch. And so this is in a summary of the two books of Maccabees. Okay. So if it really did believe it was apocryphal, non-canonical, add-ons, then why include it in a summary of the chief books of the Bible, right? Kind of odd. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. Okay, sorry. So let's look at the prefaces. Now that's just, I zoomed in on that one section. Okay. Okay, here is the third Esdras. And boy, I think I have a bad edition of this. Oh, darn it. Here, let me bring it up on my other computer. Third, fourth Esdras. Notice right in the title of fourth Ezra, it says, which is Apocrypha. So right off the bat says that. Yeah, I have my old version there too, darn it. Sorry, folks. I thought I was totally prepared for this, and apparently I'm not. Okay, let's bring the other thing up. Okay, because I have translations of everything. All right. So for third Esdras, it says, these latter two books of Esdras are not canonical, nor are they held in Hebrew. That's what they say. And then it just says, with fourth Ezra, it just says, is Apocrypha. Tobit, it has a tiny little inscription in the margin. I don't know if you can make that blob out on the far left. But this apparently says it is not canonical. Okay, so that Metzger, you could check that box for Metzger. He got that right. And then here is Judith, and it says is not in the canon. It actually has that in the subtitle for the book of Judith. Very interesting. The book of Esther. Now remember, Esther has Deuterocanonical sections in it. And it says the book of Esther, which is placed among the Hagiographa by Jerome. That's kind of interesting. It says that. I just wanted to include that. I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, then we come to wisdom. And wisdom says it is not found in Hebrew, nor is it in the canon. And then you have Sirach. Here's Sirach. And it says we don't have it in Hebrew. Now, notice it doesn't say it's not in the canon. It just says that it's not in Hebrew. So I guess technically Metzger's wrong that each book of the so-called Apocrypha, it says it's not in the canon, when actually Sirach apparently gets a pass. Baruch, do I have Baruch? Yes. Baruch, it says we don't have it in Hebrew. It doesn't say anything about its canonical status. And then we have Maccabees. This is First Maccabees. It says it's not in the canon. But notice, I mean, it's like crammed in the margin off to the side. But Second Maccabees, there's no indications whatsoever. It doesn't say anything about that. So Metzger isn't quite correct that each of these books is explicitly said not to be in the canon. Some are, some aren't. Apparently, it wasn't really important for the publisher. Otherwise, they would have made sure that each and every book was distinguished like that. And again, I think this is really because of that facet of, they want to give both the Christian, the Catholic, the church's Bible, and at the same time make the readers aware of the rabbi's Bible and where these books stand with the rabbis. And it adopted Jerome's language of canonical, but you can see here that apparently it just wasn't very consistent. Must not have been high in their pecking order. And then I also wanted to show this at the very end of Second Maccabees. It says the end of the Old Testament. So this Bible understood that the Deuterocanonical books are part of the Old Testament. So it wasn't like it wasn't segregated like it would be, say, for the King James Bible, 1611, or the Geneva Bible, or some of the early Protestant Bibles that put it in appendix and placed it between the Old and New Testament. They would not consider them books of the Old Testament, but but like Martin Luther in his German translation, he did believe these books were part of the Old Testament, even though they were not held equal to the proto-canonical books. So with this Petreius's Bible, I think Metzger's comments come a little closer to what he's shooting for. But, if anything, all it shows is the confusion that was reigning during the Middle Ages, and the confusion caused specifically by Jerome, right? Because you can see this Bible is heavily indebted to Jerome. And so it adopted some of his language. And that's why you have these tiny marginal notes for some of the Deuterocanon that it's either not in the Hebrew and not in the canon, or just not in the canon. And I think we're going to leave it there. One thing, let me look really quick. One last note. Do any of them say that they're Apocrypha? Let me look really quick. Because we saw with Esdras, they're not in the canon. Okay, so third Esdras just says It's not it's not canonical. It's not Hebrew. Fourth Ezra says apocryphal. Judith says it's not in the canon. Wisdom says it's not in the canon. Sirach says it's not in Hebrew. Baruch says it's not in Hebrew. First Maccabees says it's not in the canon. Second Maccabees doesn't say anything. So none of them are identified as apocrypha in the marginal notes. That's kind of interesting. All they're said is that they're not canonical, which again was what Jerome says in his prefaces. And remember, folks, let's see if I can scroll all the way back to the beginning. Remember that Jerome's prefaces has a very, very big footprint in this Bible. Yeah, see all these? This is all Jerome. All Jerome. All right. So hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, it's a short video. And, that's what we do here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. We run down things and try to look critically at some of the really bad argumentation that's used to establish the Protestant Old Testament and bring to light the truth of the historic Christian Old Testament. So please, if you like it, please subscribe, hit the bell. Also, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support. There's lots of freebies up there on Patreon. We're going to be doing a whole bunch of new things with this channel, which I'm really excited about. And yeah, so I hope everybody have a great week. Bye-bye.